It started as a regular night, a smooth drive home in a brand new luxury car, music low, city lights flashing by. But in an instant, everything changed. Red and blue lights filled the rear view mirror. A routine stop? Maybe. But the moment the officer approached with a smirk and asked, "Whose car is this?" Darius King knew this wasn't about traffic laws. This was about something else. The accusations came fast. The doubt, the disrespect. A simple question turned into a public spectacle. But what the officer didn't know, he had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and the whole world was about to watch. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. Was about to watch. He relished the rare moment of solitude. No entourage, no cameras, just him and the open road. Everything felt perfect as he glided through the city. The hum of the engine a soothing rhythm. This car wasn't just a machine. It was a testament to his hard work, his success, his journey. But the atmosphere shifted when a police cruiser appeared in his mirror, its headlights too close for comfort. Darius King remained calm, hands on the wheel, confident he'd done nothing wrong. Still, the cruiser trailed him, turn after turn, until red and blue lights flooded the night. Frustration built in his chest as he pulled to the curb, signaling and turning off the engine. It wasn't the first time he'd faced suspicion, simply for driving an expensive car as a black man, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. When the officer approached, Darius King kept his movements deliberate, his tone calm. "Evening, officer, is there a problem?" The officer's first question struck a nerve. "Whose car is this?" The disbelief in his voice was palpable. Darius King forced a polite reply. "It's mine." The officer's skeptical gaze lingered, his next words cutting deeper. "You got proof of that?" Keeping his patience in check, Darius King reached for the glove compartment, moving slowly to avoid escalating the situation. Even then, the officer's hand hovered near his holster. Darius King handed over his paperwork, watching the officer retreat to his cruiser to scrutinize the documents. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The weight of the situation pressed down on Darius King as a second officer joined the first, whispering phrases that made his stomach churn. "Doesn't add up, could be stolen." When the first officer returned, his demand hit like a hammer. "Step out of the car." Darius King stared at him, his frustration spilling over. "You serious?" He had provided everything, his ID, registration, proof of ownership. What more could they possibly need? The officer's smirk, a thinly veiled power trip, only added fuel to the fire. "Unless you got something to hide," he taunted. Darius King clenched the wheel, inhaling deeply to calm the storm brewing within. A small crowd began to gather nearby, their phones recording the unfolding scene. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a moment loaded with implications, a moment that could escalate, go viral or worse. It was no longer about his car or the paperwork. It was about the unspoken assumptions, the systemic prejudice he couldn't escape even as a man of success and stature. The night had started with freedom, but now it felt like a trap, a bitter reminder of how quickly suspicion could strip away dignity. The silence between Darius King and Officer Terrence Walker stretched, thick and weighted. The air felt different now, tense, charged, suffocating. This wasn't a routine stop. Darius King could tell by the way Terrence Walker stood, his shoulders squared, hand resting dangerously close to his belt. He wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to prove a point. Terrence Walker's eyes flickered across the sleek black luxury car, taking in every polished inch of it, as if it didn't belong in Darius King's possession. The streetlights reflected off the glossy paint, making the moment feel almost surreal. Then the first words came, and Darius King instantly knew how this was going to play out. "Whose car is this?" Not, "License and registration." Not, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Number he had skipped past protocol and gone straight to accusation. Darius King's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His voice, however, remained calm, measured, controlled. "Mine." Calloway didn't react at first. He just stared, as if waiting for Darius King to trip over his own words, as if expecting a lie. Finally, he gave a slow, exaggerated nod. "Yours." His tone was mocking, doubtful. like Darius King had just claimed to own a spaceship. Darius King exhaled, forcing himself to stay patient. That's right. But Terrence Walker wasn't listening. He leaned in slightly, his posture rigid. You got proof of that? Darius King had been through too many situations like this to be surprised. The disbelief, the suspicion, the immediate assumption that a black man in a luxury car must have stolen it. It was tiring. Without a word, Darius King reached toward the glove compartment, slowly, deliberately. He had learned years ago not to move too fast, not to give them any excuse. But Terrence Walker's hand twitched toward his holster anyway. Darius King's fingers froze inches from the latch. You got a problem? He asked, his voice even but edged with irritation. Terrence Walker narrowed his eyes. Move slow. Darius King clenched his jaw. Move slow. Right. Because pulling out his own paperwork was suddenly a threat. Still he followed instructions, retrieving his registration and ID, and holding them out. Terrence Walker took them without even glancing down. Darius King knew what was coming next. The officer took a step back, turning his attention to his partner, a younger cop named Officer Julian Brooks. Run the plates, Terrence Walker ordered, his tone sharp. Julian Brooks hesitated, just for a second. And in that moment, Darius King saw it, the doubt, the flicker of uncertainty in the young cop's eyes. Julian Brooks wasn't as sure as Calloway was. Darius King caught his gaze through the side mirror, and for a split second, he saw something that looked almost like an apology. But then Julian Brooks nodded and stepped away toward the cruiser. Darius King inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm, collected, unreadable. This was the game they played. Accused first, forced the suspect to prove their innocence. Terrence Walker, meanwhile, took a slow lap around the car, his fingers trailing across the glossy exterior, like he was inspecting a crime scene. Darius King had seen this move before. It wasn't about checking for damage or confirming the plates. It was about power. He turned back to Calloway. Mind telling me what I'm being stopped for? Calloway smirked, folding his arms across his chest. Just making sure everything checks out. That right? Darius King's patience was wearing thin. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you assumed this car doesn't belong to me. Terrence Walker's smirk widened. Just doing my job. Darius King chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Funny, he muttered. Your job seems to start with accusing people instead of following actual procedure. Calloway's expression darkened. What's your problem? He snapped. If the car is yours, you got nothing to worry about. Darius King's eyes flickered toward Julian Brooks, who was now speaking into his radio, probably confirming that the registration matched Darius King's name. But Calloway, he wasn't done. He leaned into the window again, voice dropping to something lower, something meant only for Darius King to hear. How does someone like you afford a ride like this? Darius King's breath hitched. There it was, the real question. Not is this your car? But how could you possibly afford it? Darius King exhaled sharply, his patience dangerously close to snapping. I work for it, he said, his voice steady but laced with icy restraint. That's how. Terrence Walker let out a low chuckle, like the very idea amused him. Yeah, he said, tilting his head. Doing what? Darius King let the silence stretch, refusing to give him the satisfaction of an answer. Terrence Walker took it as defiance. You sure about that, big guy? He taunted. Because I've seen a lot of cars like this. And I've seen a lot of guys like you. And let me tell you, he smiled. A slow, smug, deliberate smile. They don't usually go together. Darius King's blood boiled. He knew what Terrence Walker was doing, pushing, testing, looking for a reaction. But Darius King wasn't about to give him one. Instead, he just smiled back, a slow, knowing, unshaken smile. You done? Darius King asked. Terrence Walker's smirk faltered just slightly. Then Julian Brooks returned. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. The plates check out, he muttered. Cars registered to him. Silence. Terrence Walker's jaw locked. Julian Brooks glanced between them, clearly sensing the tension in the air. Darius King's smile widened. Well, he said, raising a brow. Guess that means we're done here, right? Terrence Walker didn't move, didn't speak, didn't admit he was wrong. Instead, he took a slow step back, eyes still locked onto Darius King's, his expression unreadable. Then he radioed for backup. Darius King's smile vanished. His jaw tightened as the realization hit. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. A sharp voice cut through the night. "Yo, what's going on?" Darius King glanced to his right. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording. Terrence Walker noticed too. His eyes flickered to the cameras, and for the first time Darius King saw something that looked a little like doubt, or maybe fear. Darius King leaned forward slightly, his voice low but lethal. "You nervous, officer?" Terrence Walker's nostrils flared. But Darius King? He just sat back, watching the storm he knew was about to come. The air was thick with tension. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the polished black surface of Darius King's luxury car, casting eerie reflections against the nearby storefronts. A crowd had started to gather, their murmurs growing louder as more people stopped to watch. Some held their phones up, recording. Darius King had been through too many situations like this to be surprised. But that didn't mean he was going to sit back and take it. He inhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady, controlled, measured. "Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" His question cut through the noise, directed straight at Officer Calloway, who stood firm, arms crossed, his smirk still in place. "You're not free to go until we figure out whose car this is," Calloway said smoothly, as if he were enjoying the power trip. Darius King's jaw tightened. This was a game, and Calloway was playing it with confidence, knowing that he held all the cards, or at least he thought he did. Darius King refused to break eye contact. "I already told you," he said, voice calm but laced with warning. "It's mine. You have my license, my registration. If you don't believe me, run the plates." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge. For a brief second, Officer Julian Brooks, the younger cop, hesitated. His eyes flicked between Darius King and Calloway, as if debating whether to follow logic or loyalty. Darius King caught that hesitation. Julian Brooks wasn't convinced this was necessary. He wasn't sure Darius King had done anything wrong. But Calloway, he wasn't backing down. Instead, he reached for his radio. Darius King's stomach tightened. This was about to escalate. "Unit 12 requesting additional officers at my location. Possible stolen vehicle situation. Suspect uncooperative." Darius King let out a slow, sharp exhale. Uncooperative. Darius King let out a slow, sharp exhale. Uncooperative. That was the word they always used. Not that he had refused to comply. Not that he had done anything wrong. Just that he had asserted his rights. And for some, that was enough of a threat. Julian Brooks shifted uncomfortably, opening his mouth as if to speak. But before he could, the distant wail of additional sirens filled the air. This was getting out of hand, fast. Darius King glanced around, noticing how many people were now watching closely. The crowd had doubled in size, drawn by the spectacle of one man versus an entire police presence. And then, live streams began. A young woman near the curb held up her phone, whispering, "Yo, this is crazy. They're harassing him for no reason." A man standing next to her shook his head. "They know who he is. They just don't care." Darius King heard all of it. He felt all of it. Terrence Walker, however, didn't seem fazed by the cameras. If anything, he seemed emboldened by the attention. "You're making a mistake," Darius King warned, keeping his voice firm. Terrence Walker chuckled, amused by the defiance. "Yeah, and what mistake is that?" Darius King leaned slightly forward, his hands still resting on the wheel. "Not running the plates when I told you to." For the first time, Calloway's smirk faltered, just slightly, because deep down he knew Darius King was right, but his ego wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he took a slow step back, tilting his head, studying Darius King like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You got a lot of confidence for a man sitting in a car that doesn't belong to him." Darius King's a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You got a lot of confidence for a man sitting in a car that doesn't belong to him." Darius King's patience snapped. "You keep saying that." He shot back, his voice finally sharpening. "But you know damn well you haven't checked yet." The crowd murmured louder. Darius King wasn't just defending himself now. He was exposing Calloway's game. And Calloway knew it. Julian Brooks, standing to the side, shifted on his feet. His discomfort was growing, and then the backup arrived. 3 more police cruisers pulled up, doors flying open as additional officers stepped out. Their hands hovered near their belts, eyes scanning the scene with immediate suspicion. To them, Darius King wasn't a man driving home. He was a suspect, a problem to be dealt with. A slow simmering anger burned in Darius King's chest. All of this for what? A traffic stop? A car that belonged to him? The weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders. He could feel the crowd's growing frustration. The officers standing beside their cruisers exchanged brief, silent glances, waiting for Calloway's signal. And Darius King realized something in that moment. Calloway didn't want proof. He wanted control. And that was a problem. Calloway stepped forward again, voice dripping with mock concern. "You know I'd hate for this to get out of hand," he said, loud enough for the cameras to hear. "But you're not really helping yourself right now." Darius King's jaw locked. "I'm not helping myself," he repeated. "I gave you my registration. I gave you my ID. I told you to run the plates, and you're the one who won't do it." The crowd murmured again. Darius King could feel the shift happening. "Gave you my ID. I told you to run the plates, and you're the one who won't do it." The crowd murmured again. Darius King could feel the shift happening. People weren't just watching now, they were witnessing. A woman's voice called out from the sidewalk. "He gave you everything. Why are you still holding him up?" Terrence Walker's expression hardened. Darius King smirked slightly. He didn't like that, did he? Julian Brooks cleared his throat, shifting again. Terrence Walker noticed and turned toward him sharply. "What?" Terrence Walker snapped. Julian Brooks hesitated. Then, after a beat, he muttered, "We should probably just run the plates." Silence. Terrence Walker's face darkened. Julian Brooks wasn't challenging him outright, but it was enough. The tension cracked in the air, so sharp it felt like electricity. Darius King's smirk grew. "Yeah," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's a crazy idea. Run the plates." Terrence Walker took a slow breath, his ego visibly wrestling with reason. Then finally he caved. With an annoyed sigh, he pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, I need a plate check on." He read off the numbers. The entire street felt like it was holding its breath. Darius King's heartbeat was steady because he already knew the outcome. This was his car. He had nothing to fear. And Calloway, he was about to lose. Seconds later, the static buzz from the radio came through. Then, vehicle registered to Darius King Will Williams. No flags, no alerts, everything's clean. Silence, the crowd erupted. "You see, we knew it," someone shouted. "Let him go." Terrence Walker's face turned red. Julian Brooks let out a small breath as if relieved. And Darius King, he just leaned back, letting the moment sink in. Then with a smirk, he tilted his head at Terrence Walker. "So what now?" Terrence Walker's nostrils flared, but he had nothing left because he lost. The power had shifted, and now it was Darius King's move. The tension in the air had thickened into something suffocating. Darius King could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, the growing crowd, the officers standing by their cruisers, and most importantly, the camera lenses now capturing every second of this escalating nightmare. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was a moment that could either be buried and forgotten, or blown wide open for the entire world to see. And Darius King? He knew exactly what needed to be done. Without breaking eye contact with Officer Calloway, Darius King reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his phone. Terrence Walker's eyes flickered toward the device, and for the first time, something in his posture stiffened. Darius King unlocked the screen, tapped the camera app, and hit record. "All right," Darius King said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Since this officer here doesn't want to follow protocol, let's document everything." The camera's red light blinked to life, and just like that, the game changed. Darius King turned the camera toward himself, the glow from the streetlights casting sharp shadows across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth but heavy with undeniable frustration. "It's another beautiful night in the city, and here I am, getting accused of stealing my own damn car. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some cheered in support. Others just shook their heads, watching in disbelief. Shaq slowly panned the camera toward Calloway, capturing the officer's smug expression, the very one he had been wearing since the moment this all started. "You see this guy right here?" Darius King continued, the camera locked on Calloway's face. "This is Officer Calloway. He pulled me over, and instead of running my plates like any decent cop would, he just assumed I stole my own damn car." A few voices in the crowd booed. Someone called out, "That's harassment." Calloway's jaw clenched. He finally realized what was happening. Darius King was winning the court of public opinion, and Calloway was about to be exposed on a global scale. "You're not recording me without my consent," Calloway snapped, stepping forward, reaching out as if he could somehow take the phone away. Darius King tilted his head, his smirk cold. "Oh, but I am." He gestured toward the crowd with his free hand. "And so are they." The camera panned back, showing dozens of people holding up their own phones, recording from every angle. This wasn't one video anymore. This was a movement. Terrence Walker gritted his teeth, clearly fighting the urge to react. He knew the second he laid a hand on Darius King, this would turn into a full-blown lawsuit. Instead, he doubled down. "This is a criminal investigation," Terrence Walker announced, his voice loud, as if he was speaking to an audience that would actually believe him. "You're interfering by recording." Darius King let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "That's rich," he said, still holding the camera steady. "You accuse me of stealing my own car, and now I'm the one interfering?" The crowd erupted into shouts of agreement. "Let him go," someone yelled. "This is crazy, man," another voice called out. But then, the moment that changed everything. "Wait a second, that's Big Darius King." The voice rang out from somewhere in the crowd, cutting through the noise like a bullet. A woman in a red hoodie, standing near the curb, held up her phone. People gasped. Some stepped closer. Others immediately began typing furiously into their phones, no doubt tweeting, posting, and sending out clips in real time. Terrence Walker's face paled, because now, this wasn't just some guy recording a bad traffic stop. This was a celebrity being harassed. And social media? Social media was about to go nuclear. One of the younger officers standing by a cruiser froze, his hand hovering near his radio as if he had just realized what kind of mess they were in. Officer Julian Brooks shifted uneasily, the lines of stress deepening on his face. And then, another hit to Calloway's ego. Some of the cops recognized Darius King. A few exchanged uncertain glances, as if they suddenly weren't sure how much longer they should be part of this circus. But Calloway refused to admit defeat. "That doesn't change anything," he snapped, his voice growing more defensive. "Fame doesn't put you above the law." Darius King's eyes darkened. "No," he said, his tone razor sharp, "but it sure as hell exposes who abuses it." And then, the final straw. Terrence Walker took a step closer, his voice dropping low. "You keep this up," he muttered, just for Darius King to hear, "and I'll arrest you for resisting an investigation." Darius King went still. The words hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the people recording seemed to sense the shift. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. And then, a sleek black SUV pulled up. The SUV's doors swung open, and out stepped a man in a tailored navy blue suit, polished shoes, and an expression of absolute authority. Darius King didn't even have to turn his camera to know who it was, his lawyer. Terrence Walker's smirk vanished. The lawyer, Elias Reed, one of the best in the business, strode toward them, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning the situation like a hunter sizing up prey. He barely looked at Darius King before turning his attention to Terrence Walker. "Officer," Elias said, his voice smooth, but edged with warning, "I assume you have a warrant for this investigation." Terrence Walker hesitated. "Too long." Elias gave a small, knowing nod. "That's what I thought." He pulled out his phone and held it up. "As of right now, you and your department are being watched by over 50,000 people online. That number is rising by the second." Terrence Walker's shoulders stiffened. Elias smiled. "Cold people online. That number is rising by the second." Terrence Walker's shoulders stiffened. Elias smiled, cold, calculated. And unless you'd like to spend the next few years fighting lawsuits instead of writing tickets, I strongly suggest you release my client and start thinking about how you'll explain this to your superiors. Silence. The only sound was the distant honk of a car somewhere down the street. Darius King folded his arms, waiting for Terrence Walker to realize that he had just lost. And then, with gritted teeth, Terrence Walker stepped back. "You're free to go." Darius King let the words settle before he finally lowered his phone. The crowd cheered, some clapped, others jeered at the officers shaking their heads in disgust. Darius King, however, wasn't celebrating. Instead, he looked Terrence Walker dead in the eye. And then he smiled, the kind of smile that said, "This isn't over." Because the world had seen everything, and now, Terrence Walker's real problems were only just beginning. The night air had turned thick with anticipation. Everything and now. Terrence Walker's real problems were only just beginning. The night air had turned thick with anticipation. The once murmuring crowd was now dead silent, their phones raised like a sea of blinking red lights, recording every second of what was unfolding. Darius King stood still, his arms crossed, watching Officer Terrence Walker with an expression that was neither smug nor victorious, just patient. He had already won in the court of public opinion, but now, he wanted the truth. The sleek black SUV sat idling at the curb, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Then, with a measured, deliberate step, Elias Reed, Darius King's lawyer, emerged from the vehicle. Elias was a force of nature. 6'2", broad shoulders, tailored navy blue suit crisp under the streetlights. His presence alone was enough to make the tension shift. And Calloway, he knew exactly what was coming. Elias strode toward them with the calm confidence of a man who had done this dance 1,000 times before. He held a thick leather folder in one hand, his phone in the other, already recording. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Officer Elias's voice was smooth, authoritative, and edged with something cold. "You mind telling me exactly why my client is being detained?" Terrence Walker squared his shoulders, attempting to maintain control, but his grip on authority was slipping fast. There was a report of a stolen vehicle. Matching this description, Terrence Walker said, his voice firm but lacking conviction. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He flipped open the folder and pulled out official documents, Darius King's proof of ownership. He held them up for everyone to see. "Here's the bill of sale, the insurance records, the registration, the dealership's official statement verifying that this car was purchased by Mr. Darius King legally." Elias took a step closer, voice turning sharper. "So tell me, officer, at what point in your investigation did you actually run the plates?" A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Darius King could see Terrence Walker's jaw tighten. Officer Julian Brooks, the younger cop, who had been following orders all night, shifted nervously. His hands were clenched at his sides, and sweat had started to form along his hairline. Then suddenly, he stepped forward. Julian Brooks leaned in toward Terrence Walker, lowering his voice. But in the dead silence of the street, everyone heard it. "I ran the plates, sir," Julian Brooks whispered, his voice barely audible. "The car's clean. It was never reported stolen." Darius King felt a cold rush of satisfaction course through him. Terrence Walker, however, went rigid. For the first time that night, his confidence cracked. His face paled. His eyes darted toward the crowd, then back at Elias. Because now he was trapped. There was no more bluffing. No more pushing his weight around. No more dragging this out under the guise of an investigation. The evidence was right there. The cameras were everywhere. And he was left with two choices. Admit he was wrong, or double down and destroy his own career. Darius King tilted his head slightly, watching Terrence Walker struggle with the weight of his decision. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The entire street felt like it was holding its breath. Even the people in the crowd, some of whom had been loud and vocal minutes ago, were now waiting. Then Elias broke the silence. "Well," he asked, slipping his hands into his pockets. "What's it gonna be, officer?" Terrence Walker clenched his jaw so tightly that Darius King could see the muscles flex under his pockets. "What's it gonna be, officer?" Calloway clenched his jaw so tightly that Darius King could see the muscles flex under his skin. But he knew. They all knew. This was the moment where his power crumbled, where he could no longer justify his actions, where the entire world would see him for what he really was. His gaze flickered to Darius King, and for the first time since this whole thing started, there was no arrogance in his expression, just panic. Darius King raised an eyebrow, daring him to make the call, daring him to choose whether he was about to make the worst mistake of his career or salvage what little dignity he had left. And finally, Terrence Walker exhaled sharply. Then, without another word, he took a step back. He turned toward Julian Brooks, his voice low and bitter. "Release him." The second those words left his mouth, the crowd erupted. Cheers, laughter. Some even mocked Terrence Walker, shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe he had let it get this far. Darius King, however, he didn't celebrate. He just watched, because he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Officer Julian Brooks hesitantly stepped forward, unlocking the tension in the air, Calloway's entire demeanor changed. He wasn't just defeated, he was angry. His face burned red, his fists clenching at his sides. And Darius King could tell this wasn't about justice. This had never been about justice. This was about ego, about a man who had spent years getting away with behavior like this, until tonight, until he picked the wrong man to target. Elias took a step forward, his smirk barely concealed. "Smart choice, officer." "Man to target." Elias took a step forward, his smirk barely concealed. "Smart choice, officer." Terrence Walker shot him a glare that could have burned through steel. But Darius King? Darius King simply tucked his phone back into his pocket and smiled. Not a smug smile, not even a victorious one. Just the kind of smile that said, "This isn't the end. This is just the beginning." As Terrence Walker turned, walking back toward his cruiser with rigid movements, the weight of everything that had just happened sank in. His name would be trending within minutes. The footage would go viral before sunrise. His department would be forced to respond. And Darius King? Darius King would be waiting. Because justice was coming. And for once, it wouldn't be in the hands of men like Calloway. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh white glow on the pavement as Officer Calloway stood frozen. His once commanding posture had shrunk into something smaller, something weaker. The weight of the moment, of his failure, his arrogance, and now his exposure, was pressing down on him like an anvil. The cheers from the crowd still echoed in the air, but Calloway wasn't listening. His mind was racing, scrambling for an escape. He needed a way out, a way to spin this, to twist the narrative, to salvage what little authority he had left. And then, like a man grasping at his last lifeline, he spoke. "Look," Terrence Walker started, lifting his hands, palms open, as if he could smooth this over. His voice lacked the smugness it had carried earlier. This was all a misunderstanding. A collective groan rippled through the crowd. The smugness it had carried earlier. This was all a misunderstanding. A collective groan rippled through the crowd. "Seriously?" Someone shouted. "That's what you're going with." Shaq, who had remained silent up until now, let out a slow, deep exhale. He had heard this excuse before. Too many times. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice calm but edged with something colder, something final. Terrence Walker nodded quickly, like a man trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Yes. Look, we get a lot of reports about stolen cars matching this description. We were just doing our jobs." Elias Reed, Darius King's lawyer, stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, his hands still tucked into his suit pockets, but his voice cut through Calloway's excuse like a blade. "Doing your job," he repeated, "by refusing to run the plates, by ignoring the registration when it was handed to you, by escalating a simple traffic stop into a public humiliation." Calloway's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer, because there was no answer. Then the sound of tires screeching. A new car pulled up to the scene, sleek black, unmarked. The door swung open, and out stepped Captain Samuel Bryant, Terrence Walker's commanding officer. And from the look on Bryant's face, Terrence Walker's night had just gone from bad to catastrophic. The moment Bryant saw Darius King standing there, his expression darkened. But when his eyes locked onto Terrence Walker, his disappointment was palpable. "Officer Terrence Walker," Bryant said, his voice heavy with authority. Step away from the vehicle. Terrence Walker swallowed hard. He knew what was coming. Bryant turned to Darius King first, nodding. Mr. Darius King, I sincerely apologize for this incident. I can assure you, this is not how we conduct proper policing. Darius King, arms still crossed, simply nodded back. Then Bryant faced Calloway again, his gaze now ice cold. Hand over your badge and weapon. The crowd erupted. A wave of cheers, whistles, and claps filled the air as Calloway stared in disbelief. Wait, what? Calloway stammered. Sir, this is now. Bryant's voice was sharp final. Terrence Walker's hands trembled as he reached for his holster, unbuckling the strap. His power, his authority, was being stripped away in real time. With shaky fingers, he unclipped his badge and gun and placed them in Bryant's outstretched hand. The moment the badge left his grip, he was no longer a cop, and everyone knew it. The moment was heavy, but grip. He was no longer a cop, and everyone knew it. The moment was heavy, but it wasn't over yet. Bryant turned to Officer Julian Brooks, the younger cop, who had been reluctant to escalate things, but too scared to go against Calloway. Julian Brooks, now standing stiffly beside a patrol car, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Officer Julian Brooks, Bryant said, do you have anything to add before I file an official report? Julian Brooks hesitated, glancing at Darius King, then at Calloway, then back at Bryant. Finally he spoke. Sir, he started, his voice quieter than before. I ran the plates before this got out of hand. The car was never reported stolen. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Bryant took a slow, deep breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he's trying to contain his fury. So you knew, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And you still let this happen? Julian Brooks shook his head, eyes filled with regret. I tried to say something, but Calloway. That's enough. Bryant cut him off. Then in a move that stunned even Darius King, Julian Brooks turned to face him directly. Mr. Darius King, he said, his voice shaking slightly, but his words firm. I'm sorry. Darius King stared at him. Julian Brooks' face was pale, his jaw tight, but he meant it. This wasn't just some forced apology. It was genuine regret. Darius King didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded. The crowd had seen enough. People began shouting, mocking Calloway, some calling for further action. And social media? Oh, social media was already on fire. Even before Darius King had put his phone away, his notifications had exploded. Justice for Darius King was trending. Fire Terrence Walker was gaining traction. And the video. The video was already being reposted by celebrities, influencers, and news outlets. This wasn't going away. Terrence Walker knew it, too. He wasn't just losing his badge. He was about to lose everything. Shaq exhaled slowly, his frustration still simmering but contained. He could have stayed, could have watched Terrence Walker sink further into the hole he had dug for himself. But he wasn't interested in revenge. He had bigger things to focus on. So, without another word, he turned, walked back to his car, and slid into the driver's seat. Before he could pull away, Elias leaned down through the open window. You good? The lawyer asked. Darius King looked up at him, his eyes unreadable. Then, after a pause, he let out a small chuckle. I will be. With that, he pulled off, leaving behind the wreckage of Calloway's career and the firestorm that was only just beginning. The video spread like wildfire. By the time Darius King woke up the next morning, his phone was vibrating nonstop. Missed calls, unread messages, and social media notifications flooded his screen. The world had seen everything. The hashtags #justice for Darius King and #fire Calloway were trending at #1. Major news outlets picked up the story. Headlines flashed across screens nationwide. Big Darius King accused of stealing his own car. The video that exposed it all. Police officer caught racially profiling celeb. His career is over. Every major platform had clips of the incident. The moment Calloway refused to check Darius King's registration, the second he smirked at Darius King's warnings. The split second his face dropped when Captain Bryant ordered him to hand over his badge. It was all replayed, analyzed, and discussed by millions. And then came the voices. By noon, celebrities, activists. And then came the voices. By noon, Celebrities, activists, and politicians had joined the conversation. Public figures tweeted, "This isn't just about Darius King. This is about every black man who's been profiled, disrespected, and harassed. Enough is enough, famous actor." Darius King had the resources to fight this. But what about those who don't? "We need justice for all." Civil rights leader. How many more times will we see this same story? The system is broken. Prominent athlete. Athletes, musicians, and even lawmakers spoke out, calling for immediate action. Some demanded Terrence Walker's arrest. Others pushed for police reform. But the one thing they all agreed on? This time, they wouldn't let it slide. As expected, once the internet set its sights on Calloway, they dug deep. Within hours, investigative journalists uncovered a pattern. Past complaints, multiple accusations, reports of misconduct. It turned out this wasn't Calloway's first offense. Past complaints, multiple accusations, reports of misconduct. It turned out this wasn't Calloway's first offense. He had been written up twice for using excessive force. Both cases were quietly dismissed. He had previously pulled over another black man under suspicion of driving a stolen car, only to be proven wrong. Complaints from citizens described him as hostile, aggressive, and power-hungry. But this time, he wasn't getting away with it. As the pressure mounted, reporters flooded Darius King's mentions. They wanted an interview, a reaction, a statement. So later that evening, Darius King finally spoke. He didn't do a press conference. He didn't go on TV. Instead, he recorded a 1-minute video and posted it to social media. Sitting in his home, dressed casually, he looked directly into the camera. His voice was calm, controlled, but beneath it you could feel the weight of the moment. "This isn't about me," he began. "This is about every person who gets stopped for looking suspicious in their own car, their own neighborhood. It's about the ones who didn't have a camera, the ones who didn't have a platform, the ones who couldn't prove their innocence before it was too late." He took a deep breath, letting his words settle. "We've seen this happen too many times, and every time we get the same excuses. It was a misunderstanding. We were just doing our job." He looked suspicious. He shook his head no more. Darius King leaned forward, his voice firm. "It's time for real change." The video exploded. Millions watched, commented, and shared. It was raw, unfiltered, and powerful. And the world listened. With the pressure mounting, the police department was forced to act. The police department was forced to act. Within 48 hours, they issued a public apology.